This is a global issue that needs attention from the United Nations. The people that treat blood and plasma as a global commodity, as brokers, broker it as if it's gold or silver, these people need to be reined in.
Some of my competitors resent this, but I used to define the United States as the OPEC of blood because we supplied most of the rest of the world.
You've got a product that is essentially a pharmaceutical, and yet blood is freely given. They call it the gift of life, and yet people make money from it.
Blood always has a risk, both known and unknown, and so safety is a relative term.
It's always in short supply because you need donors, and the donors have to be free of disease, not only telling you they're free of disease, but testing free of disease.
It's saved millions of people over the centuries, certainly in the post-war period, and yet with the hepatitis and AIDS problem, it's killed tens of thousands of people.
4,000 men, women, children, dead.
This is a life-giving substance. It's critical for people to survive. People need to understand what's at stake, their health and well-being, and they don't really get that yet.
I didn't want people to suffer the hell that I had to go through and that my children had to go through. And I didn't want this ever to happen again to anybody.
Last year I made a pumpkin that looked like a kitty cat. You remember that pumpkin? We found out like in the 4th month when I was pregnant that I had twins. They do the regular testing, they do the heel pricks and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then when I finally got to the room, they brought Jesse and his heel prick kept bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. And we were all sitting there and the doctor comes in and says, you know, we've done some tests and they are hemophiliacs. And I'm like, what's that?
Hemophilia is an inherited bleeding disorder that disproportionately affects males greater than females, and it is characterized by a deficiency in blood clotting. Bleeding can occur spontaneously and often occurs internally into joints, muscles. The recurrent bleeding about muscles and joints can cause not only pain, but disability.
We'd be playing downstairs in our basement, and I remember pulling something off a toy shelf and it hitting me on the head. And I got a big goose egg on the top of my head, you know, and the next morning the pillow would be soaked with blood.
The treatment for hemophilia requires intravenous administration, IV, needle sticks, with factor that was derived from human blood. So when you're talking about a very young child, getting a needle into a vein is a very difficult thing.
They used to have to hold me down. I was one of them people that could never be standing me and just looking at one kind of made me shiver, you know. But being stuck with one, I was a little kid, I would scream, holler, they would hear me floors above.
I'm the president of the Tennessee Hemophilia.
This is a global issue that needs attention from the United Nations. The people that treat blood and plasma as a global commodity, as brokers, broker it as if it's gold or silver, These people need to be reined in.
Some of my competitors resent this, but I used to define the United States as the OPEC of blood because we supplied most of the rest of the world.
You've got a product that is essentially a pharmaceutical, and yet blood is freely given. They call it the gift of life, and yet people make money from it.
Blood always has a risk, both known and unknown. And so safety is a relative term.
It's always in short supply because you need donors, and the donors have to be free of disease, not only telling you they're free of disease, but testing free of disease.
It's saved millions of people over the centuries, certainly in the post-war period, and yet with the hepatitis and AIDS problem, it's killed tens of thousands of people.
4,000 men, women, children, dead.
This is a life-giving substance. It's critical for people to survive. People need to understand what's at stake, their health and well-being, and they don't really get that yet.
I didn't want people to suffer the hell that I had to go through and that my children had to go through. And I didn't want this ever to happen again to anybody.
Last year I made a pumpkin that looked like a kitty cat. You remember that pumpkin? We found out like in the 4th month when I was pregnant that I had twins. They do the regular testing, they do the heel pricks and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then when I finally got to the room, they brought Jesse, and his heel prick kept bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. And we were all sitting there, and the doctor comes in and says, you know, we've done some tests, and they are hemophiliacs. And I'm like, what's that?
Hemophilia is an inherited bleeding disorder that disproportionately affects males greater than females, and it is characterized by a deficiency in blood clotting. Bleeding can occur spontaneously and often occurs internally into joints, muscles. The recurrent bleeding about muscles and joints can cause not only pain but disability.
We'd be playing downstairs in our basement, and I remember pulling something off the toy shelf and it hitting me on the head. And I got a big goose egg on the top of my head, you know, and the next morning the pillow would be soaked with blood.
The treatment for hemophilia requires intravenous administration, IV, needle sticks, with factor that was derived from human blood. So when you're talking about a very young child, getting a needle into a vein is a very difficult thing.
They used to have to hold me down. I was one of them people that could never be standing me and just looking at one kind of made me shiver, you know. But being stuck with one, I was a little kid, I would scream, holler, they would hear me floors above.
I'm the president of the Tennessee Hemophilia and Bleeding Disorder Foundation, and my focus is a cure. You'll be amazed how many people with hemophilia, they rely completely on the doctors and not themselves, researching, doing it themselves, and it's up to our chapter to teach these people that you do have a choice on what products you want to use. Our life is normal. Even though we do shots, you know, I don't think we would know it any other way. You have to learn to adapt. I never thought I could. Never thought I could. But you have no choice. You take care of your kids the best way you can.
This is a box of Factor. It's valued at about $1 a unit. This is 500 units.
No? This one's big. Now what do I do? Row your boat?
When they told me that we were going to be giving shots every other day and what all was involved, I decided we'd better build us a cabinet to hold all of the syringes and saline and heparin and Huber needles and gauzes.
Down the stream. Really, not this better. Stream. Yeah. Both of them have a port. We call them doorbells. The little thing underneath the skin. It's just iodine. Iodine? Round and round and round they go. and you can give the factor through their ports. Jesse's port has a blood clot in it, and he's outgrown it. Nobody think. I've been learning to stick veins and practicing on Daddy.
Basically, the boys have been able to live normal lives with every other day infusions. They think all kids get shots.
Okay. Whoa, it can lift it.
They're just as active as any other kid, but they love to jump on the trampoline and swing. Having a lot of fun raising them.
We believe that hemophiliacs are the canaries in the coal mine of the blood supply. As you know, canaries were used as the first indicator that there would be a gas leak in a mine, and it could kill many people. As soon as something goes wrong with the blood supply, we are the first ones that'll show evidence of it. We are the warning system for the American public. And as soon as they see something happen in the hemophilia community, they better be aware that it's going to happen in the entire American public who are using blood.
We see this as the most intimate hemophilia issue because we were never told.
My father is Corey Dubin, the president of the Committee of 10,000.
If you want to know what that is.
Infusing really was a big thing. He would do it before we would do a strenuous activity, or if he had gotten bonked somewhere, he would have to do that.
They'd gather around and they'd bring Sam in, and I'd sit there and pump the stuff in my arm and we'd have fun. And there was no thought of death. I just had hemophilia and they understood that.
Corey Dubin and myself both have something in common: hemophilia, HIV, hepatitis. But we have a driving force of, we know down deep inside that what we want to do is we want to make this a better society for people with hemophilia and HIV, and for the American public who uses the blood supply.
We had to get into the regulatory system. We had to. We had to sit at that table, demonstrate that consumers knew their stuff, could be a force for change. You and I and John.
Corey and Dana are known as Squeaky and Freaky. Obviously, in seeing the two of them, you don't need an explanation. They were brought together through this community with hemophilia and HIV, and to see them together, even though I see them together a lot, it never ceases to amaze me at just the special relationship they have. There's a love between them. You couldn't describe it any other way except brotherhood.
It's unique that both of us are born on the same day, March 3rd, but to look at him and look at me, we are opposites. I'm the person who goes in and kind of has the conservative look. Corey goes in and he has kind of like the liberal look. And we work so well together of being able to help people understand the hemophilia history as well as the hemophilia policies that we're trying to institute through Congress.
Dana sits on the Safety and Availability Committee. I'm on the DPAC.
Maybe a public mailing.
The Blood Products Advisory Committee advises the FDA, as the Blood Safety and Availability Committee advises the HHS Secretary. And whether or not we've learned the lessons of the 1980s.
I say, what do we want? We want justice and relief. And when do we want it? We want it today.
I've got a son who has hemophilia, and a third of the cases occur spontaneously, just a genetic upset. And that was the case with my son. In 2/3 of the cases of hemophilia, there is a family connection.
When we're talking about the history of hemophilia, one of the famous cases was the Tsar's son, Alexis, who had hemophilia. And this was very devastating to the royal family. There was a famous book written on this by Robert Massey called Nicholas and Alexandra.
His eyes were just staring. And we go into the emergency room. They said, what happened? I said, he's a hemophiliac, and I believe he's bleeding in the brain. And we met with the doctors, and he could die on the surgery, or we can just take him home and let him die with us at home. So we brought him home to die at home, and we had hospice taking care of him. We set up a little bed on the couch. and my mom had stayed here for 3 months. So they had him out on the deck, and it was like in September, and there was no wind. It was just calm as it can be. And all of a sudden, there was this big wind came, and Joey took this deep breath. And they both looked at each other and said, I think he's going to make it.
Oh, thank you.
I could tell, my mom would get wore out from the hospital visits. She had 3 hemophiliacs, me and my 2 other brothers, so, it was a constant for her to go to the hospital. And her being a single mother and all, it's a big strain, You got to deal with doctors and bills. I was the baby of the family, and Patrick was in the middle. And my older brother Steve was a little bit too old for me to hang out with, so I'd always go out with Patrick and his friends and, do everything with Patrick.
They wouldn't let me do racquetball in PE, so all the guys were doing racquetball, and they stuck me in with the girls' gym class doing weightlifting,
I dreamed about being a professional football player or a professional baseball player or anything, just the normal dreams I guess kids would have. And it didn't hit me until about 3rd grade that, hey, I can't do it. It more or less brought around a lot of gossip around me, hey, this kid's got a disease, and that's real devastating, to somebody in junior high when, you can't even get somebody to sit next to you at the lunch table.
So many hemophiliacs have died quietly. We were used to hiding hemophilia because as a man, you didn't want anybody to know your weaknesses anyway. You're growing up in high school, you don't want guys to know that you bleed easy.
Historically, we have assumed that only men can inherit bleeding disorders. The majority of women who come to our attention are women with increased bleeding during menstruation or bleeding after childbirth. And they would have a form of von Willebrand's disease.
This is one of but many ironies that have taken place over this history of blood. The first transfusion I was able to document took place in 1667, in which one of Louis XIV's doctors transfused the blood of a calf into a madman. It was thought to be psychologically therapeutic. It wasn't. But really, it was after the turn of the century that Carl Landsteiner discovered blood types, and Alexis Carrel in New York was able to transfuse blood from a father to his daughter, actually by stitching their blood vessels together. The first real blood bank actually was created in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The Russians found that they could use the blood out of cadavers to revive living people. And in the late 30s, a doctor in Chicago said, why don't we call it a blood bank, just in time for World War II.
From a blood bank in England go shipments of blood plasma and whole blood to save American lives in France. After processing, the whole blood is flown to Normandy. The plasma is delivered in the midst of battle to a front-line aid post for emergency transfusion. On every battlefront, the Red Cross Blood Donor Service is helping to save lives.
Many people don't necessarily know that the Red Cross is the major blood collector in the U.S. And a lot of this is used, of course, for transfusions during surgery and things of that type.
We just give blood to people randomly, make people awfully sick because you have to really type and cross-match. That is, match the individual who donated to the individual recipient.
When I found out I had hemophilia at the age of 17, I really wasn't given any kind of regime for any kind of treatment. It was, if you do have a bleed and it is serious, you probably will have to go to the hospital and have to get a transfusion, whole blood transfusion. And that was the method of treatment at that time. No one ever told me about cryoprecipitate.
The thing I remember about cryo was it was cold going into your veins for like a full Saturday. And they would hang this freezing bag and cover me in blankets, and 8 hours later I would leave.
Hemophilia A is characterized by a deficiency in a certain factor protein that circulates in one's blood, that being factor 8. Hemophilia B, called Christmas disease, there's a deficiency in factor 9. They may require replacement of the missing factor proteins.
Countries began setting up national blood systems, with some non-profit, some for-profit, some governmental, and the global plasma business was born. Plasma was fractionated in the same way that oil is distilled into petrochemicals and cracked. And one of the products of this fractionation became clotting factor.
The companies are, and most of them have changed their name for good reason. Armor, it has now taken the name Sention. The next one was the Highland division of Baxter Travenol. They still kept their name. The third one was Cutter Laboratories. They were sold to the Bayer, the drug company in Germany. And Alpha, the company that I was the president of, was owned by the Green Cross Corporation of Osaka, Japan. Baxter bought plasma from the Red Cross. The primary motivation for the drug companies is to make a profit. Business is, round numbers, $600 million a year.
When they were first born, it was, of course, the factor supply. That was my immediate concern, why they were wanting to infuse them. I was all over the factor trying to figure out what it was and where it came from and if there was any blood in the factor.
During the 1960s, they needed guinea pigs for the early Factor VIII clinical trials. I was having ankle problems, and they suggested to my father that I would make a good clinical trial person. So I was 001 in the clinical trials. As a teenager, I had a miserable time controlling these bleeds. So they poured the stuff in large numbers. And then once I decided to be a crazy freelance reporter in Central America, it was pretty clear I need a fair amount of factors to sustain my movement.
The brothers Ray and thousands of people like them all over this country hailed blood clotting products known as Factor as a tremendous medical breakthrough that would solve that problem and change their lives for the better forever. But unfortunately, there was a very dark side to this new wonder treatment, and that was the transmission of dangerous blood-borne viruses such as hepatitis and eventually HIV.
Hepatitis is hepar, which is liver, and itis, which is inflammation. And it's that chronic inflammation over years that causes scarring of the liver and ultimately destruction of the liver. When the liver fails, it's disaster. The most pronounced and visible sign is jaundice, where people turn yellow, but ultimately turn yellow and die.
Soldiers begin surviving their wounds in places like Okinawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. But one of the things they discover is the minute they go from a single donor to 2 donors and 5 donors, soldiers start coming up with what they then call jaundice.
I was the assistant director of the hepatitis division at CDC, and hemophiliacs were testing the safety of the blood system and the diseases that were associated with blood or plasma receipt. And primarily at that time, it was the disease of hepatitis C.
By 1976 and 7, FDA's announcing a crisis of transfusion-associated hepatitis. So they know. Everybody knows.
Lo and behold, come 6th grade, I got my bout with hepatitis. My eyes went yellow, and I got very ill. I remember Santa Claus coming to my door in a gown, a mask, rubber gloves, cracking the door open, and reaching in with my present. Saying Merry Christmas from behind this mask, and then shutting the door quickly.
We knew in the 70s there were dangerous viruses being transmitted by Factor VIII. And as general with viruses, pasteurization, that is heating, will kill them.
The heat treatment for hepatitis destroyed a lot of the good part of the molecule. You put 100% of the material in, and you only got 30 or 40% out. Most of us looked at that. It wasn't a big problem at that point, we didn't think, and so we dropped it because the yield loss was too great.
Unheat-treated factor has not been virally inactivated. And if you're not screening your donors at the front end, and you're not virally inactivating the product at the rear end, you got virus.
The first inkling of AIDS for the world, which was directed to us at CDC, was the occurrence of the initial cases amongst homosexual men. Those of us who worked in the field of infectious diseases in homosexual men are always concerned because the ability in the 70s, especially, of gay men to transmit disease was immense. And so once there was an outbreak, it tended to spread like wildfire.
The first patient was reported to us in early 1982. That really initiated a lot of investigations to determine whether or not it was occurring in other individuals that had hemophilia. We found 2 more cases in June and July of 1982, and so we had 3 cases. And so at that point, we were beginning to feel very certain that it was a blood-borne agent.
When the first notification of the possible HIV in factor concentrate, that notification went out to the hemophilia treatment centers as well as the National Hemophilia Foundation chapters. And the message in it was, there might be a possibility that there is a contamination in these products, but don't worry about it. You know, talk with your physician, keep treating, keep treating. And many of the physicians did not want to disseminate that information for fear that it could cause a panic.
The fact that we're dealing with a particular AIDS situation, again, is not unexpected. These people, my recommendation to them is not to be over-concerned.
In the early AIDS years, once everybody decided we got a problem here, the drug companies acted faster than the blood banks. And the blood banks were a little more, quote, idealistic, and they didn't want to seem bigoted by keeping out certain risk groups.
The difference in our screening program started in December of '82 was it was direct questioning. Usually we'd hand the donor a sheet and he'd check out the things, but this was now looking him in the eye, a rather delicate situation, saying, are you a male homosexual? Are you a drug abuser?
We have no medical or scientific evidence that justifies such a course right now, and I think it's overreaction.
That was essentially their wish, their best case scenario, their denial. They just couldn't face that what they had was an absolute killer loose in the blood supply with no way to control it and no immediate understanding of what it was.
There's profit motive on one side and there's denial on the other. Clearly, the National Hemophilia Foundation, at our first meeting with them, said, please don't take Factor VIII away from us. And it's revolutionized our lives. Home therapy allowed people to be in the middle of society instead of on the periphery, and that was a wonderful thing. But until we learn more about it, my recommendation at the time, and there were doctors around the country that followed that, was not to use Factor VIII concentrates.
They made a movie from the book the band played on. Matthew Modine played Don. I first met Don at the January 4th, 1983 meeting at the CDC in Atlanta. He was famous for being a virus fighter. Most of my competitors got up and said, you guys are crazy and you're going to hurt the industry. Don Francis got up then, pounded the table and said, how many cases do we have to have? How many people have to die before you guys do something? The chairman of the Green Cross Corporation said to me, we think you're too conscientious about safety. You're using the best test for hepatitis, and we think that you're bending over backwards to be too safe. Essentially, in November of 1983, they decided not to renew my contract, and so I left. The rest of the drug industry, to my great surprise, said, well, this will go away, and they were putting their head in the sand.
I'm a hemophiliac. I've been HIV positive since 1985. I'm here representing a few folks, 4,000, probably more by now, 4,000 dead people. In the early 80s, they sold hemophiliacs Factor, which is a very expensive product. One shot for me is $4,000. They sold Factor for 3 years to a bunch of people I know that had HIV in it, and they just forgot to tell everybody. I painted them red because red represents death, blood and death in the hemophilia community. That's how we got HIV. I figure I got about 30 seconds in front of Bear to get somebody's attention and to get maybe a point across and to
to get somebody to question why I'm out there and possibly take some information from me. So that's why I continue to take props out there. And that's just to give people that are walking by in front of the plant an idea of the number of people that are dead.
Well, in 1983, I was a Presbyterian minister. I had a son. He was born in 1980, and I had a daughter who was born the day after my graduation from seminary. I thought life was great. What led to my exposure to HIV was I was doing a church fundraiser for some kind of a charitable organization, and we were playing basketball and retrieving a rebound and coming down, landing on someone else's foot. I could feel my foot twist. And the doctor told me, she says, well, you probably need to go to the emergency room and be infused with factor concentrate. It was the only treatment that I had in my entire life.
Dr. McIntyre blows in. I said, hey, Mac, what's this mean? He says, what'd you see? I said, this CDC report. They say Haitian refugees, gay men, and hemophiliacs. What do you make of it, Mac? Don't worry about it, Corey. It's a gay thing. It ain't gonna be a problem. I went back to sleep. I woke up out of that sleep in 1985, and all the guys I grew up with died in that first round. And they died quick, ugly deaths. And don't worry about it, stuck with me. You know.
It was at that point that they also told me that it was sexually transmitted and that I needed to use condoms in order to prevent my wife from having this disease. There had already been 3 years of unprotected sex.
I remember I went out with my grandmother, and me and Patrick and Steve went to all go get tested for AIDS. About a week after that, Patrick brought me to the side and said, hey, can you keep a secret? He entrusted me with, hey, I got AIDS. And his girlfriend broke up with him. Nobody would talk to him in school. He would come home from school and just cry because kids would pick on him. He was a very popular kid. He used to have tons of friends and have parties at the house, and hundreds of kids would come. And then, when everybody found out he had AIDS, he couldn't even get one of them kids to return a phone call.
Somebody wrote on his locker, middle of school with 5,000 kids, whatever we went to school with. It was a big school, and AIDS victim die motherfucker on his locker, and big black permanent marker.
Among the victims was a young Florida boy from my constituency named Ricky Ray. He and his two brothers suffered from the hereditary blood clotting disease known as hemophilia. Ricky, who was the eldest of the three, died of AIDS. He was 15 years old.
The Rays were burned out of their house when the community found out they had AIDS and wanted to go to school.
The persecution of the Ray family down in Florida, and to the same extent, the positive visibility of Orion White was really frightening to families across the country who had lived with hemophilia very privately.
The risks were presented in very vague terms. As time went on, I realized that hemophilia wasn't a death sentence. But by the time I realized that, I already knew he was infected with AIDS.
Their jaws just dropped. And they took a test on her and found out that she was HIV positive. And from that point on, they backed out of the room. And they would not come into that room, that hospital room, unless they had a head garb on, goggles on, a mask on, latex gloves on, gowns on, and even shoe coverings on. And when they brought her food into that room, they brought it all on disposable styrofoam trays. They put it at the front door of her room and just slid it in and made her get out of bed to get it.
That was one of the worst days of my life, and then I had to tell my father, who had spent his whole life teaching me and raising me. And I think it's the first time in our lives he was ever overwhelmed by anything, because he knew he couldn't fix this one.
Corey Dubin, who's a great big muscular-looking guy, I knew him back in the 70s. He's an advocate. He's an aggressive guy, and I've been to meetings with him where he gets up and just, lays everybody out in lavender. He's lived a lot longer than most of them. If you fight, you got a better chance than if you just lie back and say, this is it.
I hunt bear by showing up at their plant in Berkeley, and I walk in front of their plant with my face painted red, dressed in black. Well, I worked for a carnival when I ran away when I was 16. In fact, I didn't take any medication with me. I wasn't a real smart hemophiliac, you know. I didn't know much about my own illness. And I thought I could get medication anywhere. And I learned a lot traveling with a carnival.
4,000 men, women, children, dead.
I got to the point where I almost died and had to go home. But what I did learn there is how to talk to people. And I learned how to use my voice to get people's attention. Yeah, because I was real hungry. I had to.
Feel free to read that over lunch or something.
Can I have another one to give to a couple of my friends?
You sure can.
Well, there was very good data in the 70s that when you paid for blood from individuals, you got a higher risk population, lower socioeconomic, more risk of having blood-borne diseases, and therefore, especially in the hepatitis field, that these individuals were much more likely to cause infection than those that volunteered their blood. Evidence has come up through the litigation process that the majority of fractionators not only were not eliminating gay men, that there was actually advertising going on, that they were bringing gay men in for other blood products, interestingly.
We used to collect high-content hepatitis B plasma to make a hepatitis gamma globulin and to make a hepatitis vaccine. The best group to get that from was homosexuals. And so we advertised to them.
Prisons, clearly sexually active gay men who were infected with hepatitis B. Those are exactly the individuals that we were saying eliminate from the plasma pools. Just for economic reasons, they really wanted to use every fraction of it. Unfortunately, what they did was to take the cryoprecipitate, where factor VIII is, from these pools of plasma from gay men, and were putting that into the factor VIII material, which was just horrid. It was as if there was truly no care about the safety of their product.
The way the plasma was pooled, you would collect whole blood from the donor, centrifuge it, and separate the plasma from the red cells, give the donor back his red cells. You were not supposed to use the high-content hepatitis B plasma to make the finished factor VIII because you knew it was coming already from a very high risk of AIDS. The thing that caused the greatest problem, I think, is that in a normal run of anti-hemophilic factor or factor concentrate, you could have up to 20,000 donors. The problem with that, as we later found out, was that if one of those donors had AIDS, the whole 20,000 lot was contaminated. We had known that with hepatitis.
First product withdrawal due to an AIDS patient being diagnosed in a previous donor was in the lots of material that came from the Red Cross.
Red Cross, typically, they were the last to test and the last to treat.
The Red Cross may have been a little bit slower. But on the other hand, I think one has to realize that since they're the major blood supplier, this is a huge undertaking.
Went to the doctor's office, took a physical, and while I was there, he asked if I wanted to take an AIDS test, and I said, sure. And I did. And about 5 minutes later, he came back in the room after about a 5-minute test. I don't know what the test is called. And he came back in and said, you tested positive. And right there, my heart just fell. You know, I was like, whoa. It's like, that means I'm dead. You know, it literally hit me. You know, I'm dead in 10 years, tops. And I thought about all the things that were going to happen to me, and I was like, well, man, I don't want to go through what my brother's going through right now. You know, with everybody laughing at him and just teasing him and this and that. So I put a gun to my head, and I was thinking, you know, just go ahead and get out of here. I didn't want this world anymore, and this world didn't want me. So, I didn't ever pull the trigger. I sat there and cried for about a week, and about a week later he calls back and he says, you don't have it.
I naively thought that there were people at the FDA whose primary concern was safety.
The Food and Drug Administration is what the FDA means, and they are responsible for regulating all of the drug companies.
From the volunteer side, the FDA, that is not associated with profit, they can take care of it themselves. That really went over to the plasma side, the for-profit side of blood collection, and left the field essentially self-regulated.
The FDA in my opinion, was always a little too palsy with that group, looking for jobs when they left the government.
There was $800 million of product in the pipeline when this thing started to really break. And it was very clear that FDA was not prepared to order it destroyed.
They should have studied what was in the blood instead of just kind of forgetting about it and sending it out anyway.
And we were all around the table, and Patrick had an IV in him and had all this machine work around him. And, you know, my brother used to have a gleam in his eye. You know, he's happy. It was just that. But, you know, at the table, he looked like he just was in so much pain. And especially, you know, when you know he's going to die. And you know that, hey, you know, this is probably his last Thanksgiving. And he's miserable.
He was in the ICU unit. I got to go back there. They had him tied down to the bed and stuff. They didn't have all their proper equipment. He died right there. I was the only one in the room. Heartbeat monitor stopped, but I mean, I was sad, and I still am, but it was almost as if there was a wave of relaxation came through the room, like all this pain and suffering that he'd been through for the last 10 years was finally over.
I was beyond upset. I was crushed. Now finally, after all these years of worrying about when he's going to die, he's gone. And I'm never going to be able to see him again or hug him or even tell him I love him, you know? And that just hurts. It hurts really bad. I just asked her, I said, you know I love you, and if you know I love you, just squeeze my hand. And she squeezed it. And I said, you know if anything happens, I will take good care of the children. And she squeezed my hand again. That was the last time that we communicated. The next day, she died, May 27th, 1987.
I didn't particularly ask for a front seat at the Holocaust. And 17 years later, I'm still in that front seat, and I'm still going to funerals, and I'm still looking back over that 17 years saying, wow, get the number of that semi that just hit me. Anybody get their license plate?
My 3-year-old daughter comes up and sits on my lap, puts her arm around me, and she says, Daddy, I love you, and everything's going to be okay. I was thinking, I've got to do this for these kids.
By 1993, we descend on Washington. But we come to Washington with a new agenda. Compensation for people with hemophilia who were infected, and changes in the blood supply. We initially seek a congressional investigation a la Iran-Contra. We realize we're not going to get that. Senator Kennedy offers us a National Academy of Sciences investigation by the very prestigious Institute of Medicine. We know we're not going to get him to indict people, but we think we can get what we need to start to change the system. Like my little girl said when she testified, how do these people go to bed at night? Make decisions so their stockholders will reward them? But we will continue going to funerals and watching people we love and cherish just rot.
It is a product liability matter. It is, we're talking about medication products that people use to save their lives that was contaminated.
And when FDA finally outlawed unscreened inventory, Bayer shipped their last lots to Costa Rica, and they infected 1,200 guys.
we let mass murderers, give mass murderers a place of privilege in our community. I think Bayer shouldn't...
For interrupting, you need to conduct the interview in the hall. You're not authorized to be.
The other night in the exhibit hall where we were trying to do an interview in front of Bayer Pharmaceuticals, well, we were interrupted because not everybody agrees with what I'm doing. I guess I'm a rebel with the cause in this case.
Why is this country this kind of gangster capitalist attitude, which is, hey, this is what happens, sue us? Why not just take care of the people that got hurt? It's the human thing to do.
That's a Pollyannish argument. I mean, the fact is that we attempted in the 1970s to eliminate the hepatitis virus and were unsuccessful. That attempt continued into the 1980s. What you're talking about would be, at least as far as my client is concerned, the payment of tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in a situation where they haven't done anything wrong. And I don't think that that's going to happen.
What I've been doing for the last few years is I've been testifying as an expert witness in these cases. When they made this settlement, nobody was supposed to talk about it, and nobody was admitting culpability officially, but, $1 billion is culpable.
There is protection, no doubt, in the future of recalls, of civil litigation and the like, to put blame and get compensation. But in reality, this is a social responsibility that has to be taken by pharmaceutical manufacturers. Recalls are useful to highlight problems. To be honest, once something is recalled, it's far too late.
When I went to work as a clinical counselor at the Hemophilia Treatment Center in Richmond, Virginia, the doctor there had been collecting all these memos that these hemophilia treatment centers had been receiving. And as I started to look down these dates and these documents, there was no warning about don't use this because it could be hazardous to your health. It was just, there's a concern, but keep using it.
I don't disagree with the guys who say I could have been put on Cryo. Cryo also is gathered from donors. The donor pool is smaller, maybe 8 to 10 patients.
Well, if you take AIDS as an example of the difficulty in getting the true information, you have to take a lot of individual responsibility.
And oftentimes we believe that this was because many of the programs of the National Hemophilia Foundation, which was supposed to be the advocacy group for the hemophiliacs, was receiving large amounts of grant monies from the manufacturers of these products.
The problem here is that people with hemophilia needed these blood products to control bleeding episodes. So here we were caught in this terrible irony of being caught between this rock and this hard place.
And you didn't give them a choice of whether or not they should take this product or not. And because of that, they're dead.
Number one, our government was supposed to protect us.
Got with Louise Ray and said, Louise, we need a name for this. What do you want to call it? And we decided, let's call it the Ricky Ray Bill, because it would unite the hemophilia community together. So we took it to Congressman Porter Goss of Florida. So he looked at it, he was convinced, let's make a bill.
191. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Goss. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I and 21 of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle took the first concrete steps toward righting a terrible wrong.
It was a claim against the government that you were making through congressional challenge channels. That means it was met with a lot of opposition.
Congress, you have delayed this bill so long that now over half of our infected population is dead. Our government should look with shame upon its delay in acting on this bill.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate now proceeds to consideration of calendar number 707, H.R. 1023. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a third time and passed.
We are very proud that on December 12th, 1998, President William Clinton signed this bill. We did what we were told we could never do.
I think our social record on prevention is a D-.
In France, the government, the bureaucrats, their equivalent of the FDA, picked out 2 doctors who were fairly well down the line. And instead of accepting blame at the Ministry of Health, the 2 guys went to jail for a couple of years. In Japan, they were telling the doctors and the patients for 3 years that it had been heat treated when it wasn't. They had a meeting between the executives of Green Cross and the parents of the children who had gotten AIDS and who died or were dying. They got down on their knees asking forgiveness. Parents didn't forgive him.
謝罪してほしいんです。紙ペラ読んで頭カバカと下げたって私たちはそんなの許すことできません。みんな黙ってないで何か言ったらどうですか。人殺しですあなたたちは。
Most countries followed our example and killed the vast majority of their hemophiliacs.
I didn't know that 20,000 people with hemophilia just didn't matter. I didn't know that another 9 or 12,000 transfusion recipients didn't matter. I didn't know that 1,200 people in Costa Rica meant nothing, or that a few thousand in Canada and another few thousand in Japan were irrelevant. But I learned that.
You can never say that the blood supply is totally safe, but it's much safer than it was before.
Sention was closed for a while for failing to live up to a consent decree to keep its operation in good shape.
And so all of them have been shut down. That includes Alpha. The Red Cross has been shut down many times. Britain has just stopped supplying. They said all the material has to come from outside the country.
The ones that are most difficult to pick out, like HIV, are those that occurred years after exposure or decades after exposure. The overall tenet now of use blood only when it saves lives is appropriate.
It's called pre-donation. 85% of the surgeries in this country are done electively. So you know in advance, you can have the blood collected in advance. You certainly ought to do that because it's safer.
I was very interested in a preventative or prophylactic program for my son, and we've been doing that since the age of 1.5, 3 times a week, giving him medication to prevent bleeding problems. Treatment for hemophilia has become safer. Recombinant factor is a synthetic factor which may be genetically engineered.
We've never used any blood-derived factor products. If these boys were 10 years old or older, they'd likely be involved in some of the contaminated factors. We're very fortunate they were born when they were.
My father is a strong man in many ways, and it's just so hard to look at him and think, you know, when is that beast inside you going to show up? You know, when is it going to take you away?
I know what my choice would have been at that time had I had that choice. I would have said, no thank you. I'd rather treat this bleed with ice, elevation, and let me just take my chances.
If I were to do what they did, I'd get 25 to life for cold-blooded murder. And that to me is what it is, cold-blooded murder. And for one of the worst sins, for greed, you know, for money. They traded in my brother's life for a few $100s.
Somewhere around 30,000 total infections associated with blood and blood products from HIV. Another, 10, 12, 15,000 hepatitis C. We're equaling the casualty rate in Vietnam. That's a serious issue. You don't want to go to the emergency room in a car accident and they say, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, your son or daughter needs 2 units of blood. You want to know that blood's been screened with the right questions. You want to know that blood bank is operating at the highest degree of safety.
You know, I think about all the funerals that you and I have gone to. They've been too many. It takes me days to try to get over them. Sometimes it's reliving even my wife's funeral.
When you get sick in the spring, I just cried. Started crying and said, I can't go to Dana's funeral. I can't even let it happen. And, you know, it's like I wanted to get on a jet and come to Richmond and say, you can't die on me, motherfucker. I can't cope with you dying.
You are?
People need to get involved and demand from Congress rules that set standards that are enforced in a real way so the shell game comes to an end, because human beings will continually be harmed. And the question is not if another deadly pathogen will come along, it's when.
4,000!
And when the next one comes down the pipe, can we contain it to 50 or 100 people that get harmed? Or is it going to be 10 or 15,000 or, God forbid, more? We're the example of what happens when nobody's minding the store.
It's had a devastating effect on our whole family. A lot of people think of AIDS as in, oh, well, that person's got AIDS, they're going to die. Well, it's not that person. It's their whole family surrounding them.
Just thinking that my brother was going to die and not be here soon. Now, he's not going to be able to have kids, or he's not going to be able to play with my kids, or just knowing that, you know, he's not going to be around anymore. It's just, it's heartbreaking. It almost like damages your soul.
Or as long as people use blood, it's going to happen. And we have to be making sure that another blood disease doesn't come along to wipe out a population like it did the hemophilia population. The drive that really made me do what I'm doing today would be from her death, her needless death. And I believe this very day that I have made her life worthwhile.
And those of us that are still alive are devastated. And we're trying to pick up the pieces, and at the same time, we're up here working our butts off to straighten this mess out. And I will tell you, it has hurt our people. They feel abandoned by this society. They feel like this society just doesn't care at what happened.